We often talk in our last podcast, we talked about Jamie Lee Curtis and the fact that it's a little easier to enter upon recovery when you're an extremely well off actress, writer, you have a solid family, you're prosperous, you have a lot of interests and a lot of social community connections. It may not be surprising to people who understand human behavior to learn that those things are helpful for recovery, but we often forget that and imagine that everybody's equally likely to be addicted and equally likely to recover. So we talked about Jamie Lee Curtis and we talked about other people in that regard. In general, Drew Barrymore is going to have an easier time entering recovery than somebody in Appalachia or inner city Baltimore. However, we don't want to be considered, we don't want to be regarded as glossing over the fact that sometimes children in prosperous families become addicted. And in fact, ironically or not, they're the ones we most likely know about because they're not going to make a movie about a kid in inner city Baltimore. They haven't made a movie about a kid in inner city in Appalachia, where a man remembered his, humble hillbilly origins, hillbilly elegy. But in general, Beautiful Child is going to be determined, Beautiful Boy, I should say.
Beautiful Boy, yeah.
Is what, thanks. Any help in these names, throw in.
Every time that happens, I can't remember them either, so I'll try my best.
Not the best at that. We share.
Yeah, we share that deficit or whatever.
Deficits, cognitive deficits. So we want to try and make sense about that, obviously. Both of us are in industries. I mean, well, Zach works with children in school systems. So a thing or two about children's problems. And let's just say you work in a secondary school, you're aware about drug issues. That's sort of your day job almost. And I've written a number of books about, Zach and I wrote a book together, Outgrowing Addiction, which in part deals with how to avoid and overcome addiction for young people. I had previously written a book called Addiction Proof Your Child. But this issue's come to the fore recently. I mentioned, of course, Beautiful Boy, and that's sort of a perennial bestseller. And David Sheff's become an industry, as has his son. And at the same time that he wrote Beautiful Boy, his son wrote a bestseller, Tweaked, and then a follow-up, We All Fall Down. I hope I remember to discuss what the names of those bestsellers tell us. But two names in politics are coming out just now involving, sometimes it's hard to call them children, they're adults. One is Hunter Biden. He's coming out with a book in April called Beautiful Things. Hunter Biden is the younger son. Beau was the older. Beau died of a brain tumor. And Hunter's had his ups and downs, and he's writing about his family. And I don't know if you can remember, we did the podcast, do you happen to know the name of it, where we talked a little bit about the Biden family?
I don't remember what we called it. I can look it up while you're talking, though.
Go ahead. I'm going to reintroduce some of those ideas. And then somebody who's only lately achieved stardom. Madeleine Dean was one of the House managers of the impeachment process. And she's a remarkable woman. I mean, actually, I knew nothing about her except to look at her and hear her. And she's just beautifully presented, cogent, honorable human being, like virtually all of the House managers.
By the way, our podcast was called Hunter Biden, Pussy Riot, and Family Addiction Entanglements.
well, this is the follow-up. This is part 2 to that. We might mention that. And she's coming out with a book with her son named Harry Cunnane. Under Our Roof, it's quite a long title. Under Our Roof, a son's battle for recovery, a mother's battle for her son. So the Biden book isn't out yet, although I've read some things about it that I'll mention. And I don't know much about Madeleine Dean and Harry Cunnane. I know a little bit about them. So we don't pretend that we're experts on those family. I know a little bit more about the Biden family. I've been tracking them a while, but we're not here to comment on their family situations in particular. We're here to try and extract some information. And one reason it doesn't pay to focus too much on any one of them is because they give 3 different answers to the question of what should you do? And we'll try and come up with some underlying themes. But let's make some, I always like to start out by making the most obvious observations. Zach and I are 2 people who, like others, for example, Carl Hart say, well, it's not about the drugs. And it so happens that Nic Sheff, the son, David Sheff's son, in The Beautiful Son, was into meth.
Beautiful boy.
What's that?
Beautiful boy.
Beautiful boy, thanks.
I remembered it that time.
And Harry Cunnane, Under Our Roof, was an opioids person. And Hunter took a variety of substances, but he was mainly known for crack and cocaine powdered, and also alcohol. So right away, if you're looking for something to emphasize, let's talk about the opioid pandemic. We're not talking about that because that's something that often surprises people. What you and I talked in, was it our last podcast? The quiz question I presented to you was, what did, who's the English singer, the woman?
Amy Winehouse.
Amy Winehouse. Yeah. Everybody guesses drugs, but it was alcohol, possibly with tranquilizers that she was given to even out from, she had just been in treatment. And so they're not opioid people. Hunter's not an opioid person. So the second obvious observation is these are all loving, committed families. These aren't families that you go into and say, well, it's not neglect, it's not trauma. They weren't abused. These kids weren't beaten or abused or thrown out of the house. In fact, we'll talk about how much the parents went with them. That's a critical issue. And Joe Biden's kind of famous for being a loving parent. That's sort of his stock in trade. And I guess I wanted to talk about the family issues, the podcast that Zach already referenced. I've always been a little iffy about Joe Biden for reasons I'll talk about in terms of his attitude towards addiction. But Jenna Bush interviewed his 4 granddaughters, 3 of whom are Hunter Biden's children, 1 of whom is Beau Biden's child. And I was stunned by how, and among the kookiest things that we'll bring up, Hunter Biden moved in with Beau Biden's widow.
Yeah, that's still, isn't that weird?
So he's, in a way, he's the stepfather of the cousin. So the 4 of those girls were sitting there. They're different. Surprise. One was kind of a jock. One was kind of a fashion person. They were more or less talkative, but they all coordinated and cooperated and gave. By the way, he has 1 daughter, a surviving daughter that he had with Jill Biden. She was there, but she was a little bit, she's older, in the background. And the 4 granddaughters, they had an easy interchange. They were remarkably supportive. They said Joe wouldn't have run for president if they objected, and all 4 were on board for him to run for president. Remarkable people. We're going to talk about Hunter Biden, he emphasizes, in fact, his book is about how his family saved him. And in particular, he talks about a new baby. He has a new wife. And as I mentioned in the family addiction piece, I have a little trouble navigating that because he's got 3 daughters already that we saw interviewed. He had a girl he lived with as a parent for 1.5 to 2 years. He has another child in the period when he was going completely off his hinges with crack and getting arrested. He had, I believe, a daughter with another woman prior to the baby boy he has with his current wife. So it's a little hard for me to sink my teeth into the idea about how important family is and to reflect on what his family's like. But we'll get into that a little bit. So these are all 3 very different approaches, as perhaps what I've said already indicates, but I'll say more about that. The parents are all as I said, one thing in common, they all remained very close to their children. And then the second thing I'll say, with only a touch of irony, all of them wrote bestsellers. So, one of my standard bad jokes is, I don't know what the heck's the matter with those kids in Baltimore and Appalachia and rural New England. Why didn't they just write a bestseller?
Pick themselves up by their bootstraps and write a bestseller. Yeah.
Come on. How hard can it be? So I'm going to read Madeleine Dean. Let me go to her. We've talked about a little bit. We talked previously about David Sheff. We'll talk more about him. We'll talk a little bit more about the Biden family. I only learned about Madeleine Dean from watching the House impeachment, the Senate impeachment trial. She's a congresswoman who was one of the House managers, and she comes from an upscale Philly suburb, which ironically was contingent to where I lived, in a somewhat more working class Philadelphia neighborhood. I lived in Northeast Philadelphia. She's from Montgomery County, Abington High School. And I knew some people from Abington High School, and for me, they were rich people. I'm just going to run through her resume, which is sort of, if you're going to end up on television prosecuting the president, you're probably a little above average. And she went to a Catholic college. Philadelphia's famous for a number of Catholic colleges, St. Joe's, Villanova, and she went to LaSalle. She went to law school at Widener College, and then Fels Institute at Penn, which is kind of a public policy place. She got elected to Congress in 2019. After law school, she went to the Philadelphia area and practiced law with the Philadelphia Trials Lawyers, and went on to serve as executive director of Philadelphia Trial Lawyers. She opened a small 3-woman law practice and served as in-house counsel for her husband's business. And she was raising 3 young sons. She changed career paths and turned to teaching, and she was an assistant professor of English at LaSalle, where she taught writing and ethics. Whew. That's already a lifetime.
Yeah.
She started, but this is the single most amazing fact about her. She started in politics after graduating high school, when at 18, she was elected to the Abington Township Committee. How do you even do that? Who thinks of that? Well, I'm in high school. I think I'm going to run for my municipal committee.
I was getting fired from Dick's Sporting Goods, so
Right.
and she decided to run for office.
I was getting arrested by the Philadelphia police for trying to find my girlfriend who was babysitting, and beaten up by the Philadelphia police.
Yeah.
I feel she skipped those steps in life. I might have gone through, but I'm not. And then she volunteered for her first campaign for Joe Heffel's re-election to the state legislature, which is funny because she eventually ran against him and won the seat. And then she met her, that's where she met her future husband. And then she went to the Pennsylvania House of Representatives. And then when her children were grown, she ran for state representative, and she prioritized social issues: addiction, equal rights, healthcare, ethics, criminal justice reform, and gun violence. You can tell she's a decent human being. After the shooting at Sandy Hook, she became co-founder of the Gun Violence Prevention Caucus. And then along the way, during all of this, she has a son, Harry Cunnane, who I know from seeing publicity about the book, was involved with opioids. Let's say he was addicted with opiates for 10 years. And I know what Harry Cunnane does now. He's the regional resource director at Karen Treatment Centers, and that's a Philadelphia area rehab. So the other two, we'll talk more about Hunter. Hunter Biden was in and out of, I assume Harry Cunnane was in and out of rehab. When you're natively involved with opioids for 10 years and your mother's involved in addiction and very concerned, you go to rehabs. That's what happens. That's what happened to Hunter Biden. Went to a lot of rehabs just in a couple of years when he was floating around in that period where he was with his former sister, his sister-in-law, and then just roaming. He got arrested periodically for crack and cocaine, and he was into a couple of rehabs. David Sheff rejects rehabs, and here's David Sheff's approach, which I have a hard time navigating through. It's confusing to me. At one point, David Sheff reached out to me, and he came across and he said, well, we have a lot in common, but his number one lead line is that addiction is a brain disease, and that's a bad way to go on a date with me.
He sees you as like the guy who's against the American treatment industry, and so he figured we must have something to talk about.
Right.
Right.
I think that's, and well, okay, so this is what it says in Wikipedia, and you put it together. Sheff educates about addiction as a brain disease. And he's an advocate for putting addicts into therapy programs early, but he means life therapy. He's not a rehab kind of a guy. He believes life stresses and traumas are risk factors. How does that fit into being a disease? Most people think of it as a disease as being inherited or biological, and that therapy for these can help addiction prevention. So in a way, that's a little closer to where I'm coming from. It's about life experiences, and he is an advocate. This almost sounds like me. He's an advocate of life skills training to aid addiction prevention. So he starts out with the brain disease, and then he travels down to where I am, or up to where I am, but I don't see how those two things combine. I don't think, you can avoid a disease by learning life skills, which will allow you to avoid addiction.
Brain disease is shorthand for I'm compassionate.
Yeah.
And so that's the only way people know how to say I'm compassionate, how to signal their virtue that they're compassionate people instead of lock them up kind of people.
That's one thing it is. And the second thing it is let's not blame anybody. And in particular, let's not blame me.
Right.
I'm okay with that. We're not here to blame people. We're here to help people obviously avoid bad things. And we don't find that telling people they have a brain disease is a helpful thing.
Yeah.
It doesn't allow people to avoid addiction in the first place. And in the second place, it doesn't help people to overcome addiction.
So it's throwing the baby out with the bathwater, where you say, let's not blame anybody. But at the same time, what you're really doing is saying, let's not tell anybody that they can put themselves back together.
Or let's not help people to see how they can avoid that. I mean, it's a hard line. We're going to talk more about that. I've said it a million times, we're going to talk more about something.
Yeah.
How do you navigate a line between telling parents, well, parental interactions with your children matter. Things didn't go well for your child for a decade or so. That's true for all of the three kids. Hunter Biden's not a kid. Well, none of them's a kid. They're in their 30s now. Nic Sheff's 36. But they got out of it. Nic Sheff was getting out of it 20, 30, late 20-ish. So here's Hunter Biden's book comes out in April. I have a sense of where it's called Beautiful Things, which is a funny name because he's had some ups and downs. I come from a family forged by tragedies and bound by a remarkable, unbreakable love. And as I was describing, when talking about family addictions, Joe Biden, I didn't vote for him in the primaries, but he comes across as an impressive, caring human being. And as I said, I was blown away by his four granddaughters react that way to him and to his wife, who's not the grandmother of any of the biological of any of those four children. Joe Biden's first wife was killed in a car accident. So I believe that. I believe that. I know he's a caring person and he's done a good job in a lot of ways. And how did that interact with Hunter being Hunter, getting into a lot of trouble, causing a lot of trouble, and being in and out of rehabs? As I said, Harry Cunnane was, had opioid problems for 10 years. He must have been in and out of rehabs. Children from well-off families go to rehabs. That's what happens. And you and I have differing interactions with the families for sensible drug policy. You and I know people, all three of these children have survived and they all are prospering now. Well, let's hold off on Hunter Biden a minute or two. We're going to track him. He's a little older than the other two. But you and I know parents whose children have died.
Mm.
And I know a couple of them. And here's a story they'll tell you. I took my child to Florida with my husband, and we left them there, and they told us, well, we've got the best we went home, elated. Well, they're gonna cure my child. And I'm thinking of one person. I don't want to give away any information. That child died before that child was 30 years old. And so a lot of the people that we interact with are not overly impressed with treatment options. And
to say the least.
To say the least. And you wouldn't think, well, Harry Cunnane works for one. So I guess he's impressed with it. But 10 years involved with opioids, took a little while. I don't know where Hunter's going to go with his rehab experiences. It's not what he emphasizes in his book. He doesn't say it is a recovery 12-step book. And, as I said, David Sheff's kind of against the rehab experience. It didn't work for his son. He was in it now. So, now, Zach, you actually work with the Families for Sensible Drug Policy, and I'm going to take a little time. Carol Byers is the co-founder of it. Stanton Peele had, she wrote this from my memoir. Stanton Peele had it nailed in the 1970s. We should have listened then. The disease model has been a slippery slope for many of our families who are held hostage by an addiction treatment industry that has in effect acted as an arm of the industrial prison complex. Carol, she can really bring it, can't she?
Mm.
Ensnaring and diverting its victims into an abstinence-driven model where failure to adhere to compliance is sanctioned, criminalized, and shamed. Let me give the backdrop to that. If your child's died, they've been to rehab, that didn't work. And, in rehab, their claim to fame is, well, you're not going to use again. And that's not true with the children who die, obviously. And harm reduction is a matter of recognizing that an 18-year-old or a 20-year-old or a 22-year-old or a 24-year-old is unlikely to get through the next 40 or 60 years of their lives never becoming involved with drugs again. And of course, as we spoke about when we talked about Drew Barrymore, she has to say, well, I'm not sober, whatever the hell that's supposed to mean. She grew up and she used substances, and one way or another, something's going to happen that way. So the question I'm going to try and raise here is, what did those parents miss along the way that we might be able to help fill in? And I'm going to rely on Zach on this a little bit, but I'll mention a couple things. Joe Biden is an ardent disease supporter, and he's a lifetime abstainer. Joe Biden is. And he actually introduced a piece of legislation before Barack Obama made him his vice presidential nominee called the Recognizing Addiction as a Disease Act, if you can believe that. And, you know, how well did that work? He loves his son, but I haven't, the book isn't out yet, but Hunter says I had problems from the first sips of alcohol I took as a child. Huh. So what do I mean to say by that? Well, here's my plan. Joe Biden didn't drink because he had problems with alcohol around in his family. Here's one idea. Well, I'll just tell my children they can never, ever drink.
Mm.
Never drink. I don't know that this is what he did, but he certainly didn't teach him how to drink. He certainly didn't show him how to drink alcohol. I always wonder where Joe Biden comes in, his second wife, on this score. You know, so maybe she came in and said, well, I'm going to respect that and never drink. I don't think that's an asset. It's not something I look for something in people where they understand the role of alcohol and psychoactives in life, and they convey that to your children. Your children aren't going to get through life in America in the 21st century without being exposed to drugs and alcohol. That's not going to happen. So you need a backup plan. On the other hand, Joe Biden defended his son, and Hunter caused some problems for Joe because he did work for an oil company in Ukraine. As you may be aware, that was one of the main. Trump didn't have a lot for his campaign, but that was one thing. And he had a little bit of a point. Why did they pay him hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to be managing Ukraine, be on the board of the Ukraine fuel company? Because he knows nothing about fuel. He does have a law degree, Hunter Biden. He did go to law school. If he was drinking his kid and had problems, it didn't throw him completely off the rails until his brother died. And the fact that Hunter, I'm going to stop in just a second now and then throw it all back to you.
Ooh.
The fact that Joe Biden is a loving father, it's created Joe Biden doesn't, my son, like a lot of people, at home, had a drug problem, but he's worked on it and I'm proud of it. And I'm proud of my son. That's good. It is good. But Joe Biden, you don't get the sense that he had a good ability to balance reining Hunter in and supporting him, and at the same time, perhaps being clearer on a pathway he should take. And Hunter Biden had the problem that he had an older brother who was a super phenom, a military hero and a state's attorney general of Delaware, and he was going to run for the Senate or whatever. He was going to be the next big political candidate, probably a governor, whatever. And that's a lot. Him and his brother were close, but that's a lot to live up to. So rehab's not the answer, judging from these three people. They have three different sets of answers. Hunter seems to rely on the family, which isn't bad, except families to have potholes in them, even when they're a good family. Second of all, decide it's a brain disease, but teach people coping skills. In a way, David Sheff comes out the closest to where you and I would be, creating environmental. In college, he's on a million boards, David Sheff. David Sheff has made himself into an industry, a rehab industry, helping colleges do suicide prevention by teaching people emotional skills, which that's, as I said, very close to where we're at. And I don't know what Dean's approach is so much as Madeleine Dean's, other than to know that her son's now, occupied, working for rehab. Now, I'll just throw one more personal story in. Another family we could talk about, which I talk about in my memoir somewhat, is Bill Moyers, who was an important political figure and writer and public educator. I know his family. I lived in Morristown across the street from his daughter and son-in-law. And I don't know if I'm giving away too much, but me and his son-in-law, John Posicatano, used to swim naked in the woods in Morristown. And then he went on to greater heights than that, although what could be more better than that? He went on to be the head of Greenpeace. They're divorced. And then of all the strange things in life, William Moyer's son, Bill Moyer's son, William Cope Moyers, contacted me. He's a big deal at Hazleton. He did go the 12-step route. He was another prolonged in and out guy. And we're in touch from time to time. I actually asked him if he wanted to write a blurb for my memoir. That didn't happen, but he'll contact me to sound me out on certain ideas he has, even though, to all appearances, he's a total devotee of 12-step rehab programs. So, I won't say I know all about the Moyers. I know more about the Moyers family than average, I used to go out to dinner with his daughter and her then husband, with my then wife. When we weren't riding bikes and swimming, we were wilderness buffs in a suburban town. So I know something about people who say, oh, well, I'm going to get involved in this industry. My son, in this case, William Cope Moyers and Harry Cunnane, actually picked that up. So David Sheff's, I know you've thought about this a little, Zach. I mean, David Sheff sort of said, well, I tried everything and I couldn't get him better. That's why it's a brain disease. On the other hand, you have to educate people in coping and emotional skills. How do you, and you're a person who deals with children and families, can you talk a little bit about navigating that? Well, I wanted to rein my child in, they're doing the wrong thing, but you're not gonna, you take it from there. You're not gonna punish a kid into compliance. That's not how it works.
Nobody ever takes the step of being in their child's world and fully understanding, to the extent that it's possible to understand, their experience and the reasons for making the decisions that they make. So in lieu of doing that, what they do is they have a focusing illusion on some set of solutions to some set of problems that their child may or may not have. With Sheff, it's, drug addiction's a brain disease. So I tried everything to get him to stop taking drugs. But I remember that, we wrote about that scene in the movie. It was in the book too, where he's sitting down at a table and trying to talk to him, and he realizes, oh, he's so far gone, he's still taking drugs. And I thought, funny, the things that I would be talking about would have nothing to do with drugs. They'd be like, how are things going? Are you working? What are you passionate about? What do you like? What makes you happy? What motivates you? Those kinds of questions that a father would typically ask a son, whether or not they're having problems, but kind of, for me, especially if someone's having problems. And that's what I always go and do. Let me just, I don't want to make it too long, but I tie it into the school system. Teachers do that too. And especially specialists who work with kids do that.
They do the
wrong thing.
They lead to the problem.
Right. Teams of educators, I always experience this. Teams of educators and whatever it is, school psychologists or anyone that's supposed to be working with a kid whose behavior is challenging in some way, they decide on solutions. And so what they say is, well, here are the solutions that someone with these kinds of problems, and they define the problems, right, might need to work through. And then when the kid can't do it, like, oh man, I guess the problems are worse than we thought, because we just developed the solutions and they're not meeting them. So what gives? So let's throw different solutions at them. And, it just becomes this chaotic, cyclical kind of a thing where really at the foundation of it all, there could have been it seems like it takes too much effort, but there could have been a collaborative conversation that the child's invited to. And that's what I think that people are missing most often. Common sense to say, I really care about you. And then you think you don't really have to work very hard if you're a parent or someone who cares about somebody.
And all the three parents or families we talked about, the parents, all of them cared about the kids, that they're not neglect abuse families.
Right. So the only thing that I've noticed, the only thing that can really steer someone away from asking the kinds of questions that just people naturally generate when they care about somebody is ideology. Being told that there's a certain script that somebody must follow in order to help their kid or help whoever with things that beset them is the only thing I've ever seen that points people away from using their best common sense and compassion, which a lot of these people you're talking about preach.
It's funny you should say these things. I mean, I know you think them. I know you've described you're in a kind of a study group or whatever, a group, and they bring in an analysis, and there's some report written about the kid, and he's got, they analyze maybe the brain waves and they give a diagnosis, and you're sort of sitting there scratching your head, and you go, well, what's the kid say? And that's like, who thought of that?
Yeah.
Crazy idea. And the way you describe that process, I mean, you, as I sometimes have pointed out in an interview I did with you, you're always employable. In other words, they all follow this other approach, but then they say, well, the kid's got a problem, let him talk to Zach. You know what I mean? It's sort of, he has this sort of magical quality, like the Pied Piper, where he can sort of communicate with the kids. And I obviously, you'd start out by saying, well, that's the first thing I do is I talk to the kid and I sort of see where he's coming from.
I'm almost like in the consulting realm, it's almost like people might not respect me, but it's like you have this experimental surgery in some other country, and that's what I am to them. Well, he's done this before, and I don't really know what he's doing, but I guess people have walked away feeling okay, so we could try it.
And the problem, I know we're getting a little too much into your problem is they'll employ you. But when you say, well, why don't we try my whole approach in place of this other approach? They say, what are you, crazy?
Yeah.
By the way, I had an unusual experience yesterday. This is the main podcast in the universe, the one you and I do. But I was doing some interview with some rehab center that has a podcast. And they wanted me to do what people seek to do. They say, well, tell us what the life process program is. Tell us how to, what it is. What is it? How do you do it? And then, my normal way of responding is to sort of ask them some questions. Well, what do you know about my approach? Or what do you find? These people are at a rehab center. I say, well, what works there the best? And I start exploring that. And they said, we don't want you to ask us questions. We want you to tell us what the life process program is. And I said, well, the life process program is a process, and I'm kind of engaged in the process with you. And the whole process is about, in the case of helping a person cope with addictions and other problems, is getting them to organize their own thinking around their values and their goals and where they want to go in life, and sort of juxtapose that against how things are going. And you do that with children too. They want to be happy and respected and successful, but they're not seeing the connection between their activities and getting there.
Perfectly said. So you were saying, you're kind of tacitly saying, I'm asking you these questions, and trust me, your answers to them in our dialogue are going to get us somewhere interesting. But they're saying, we want the short, simple answer, and that's really a nice microcosm for all of this.
And so, if you were to be in all of these situations are over, Hunter Biden's 50-ish, and William Cope Moore's, I don't know, same. And, Harry Cunnane, I mean, I happen to know that David Sheff is 36.
Yeah.
He kind of got better towards his late 20s. It took a little while to get there, a little longer than, Maya Salovitz, who was more early 20s, which is a little more commonplace. But if you were to interact with the family, how do you deal with it? Well, they come we're talking about you being in a school setting and they come in with a report, and then you say, well, how do you make talk to the kid? What's the kid say? How do you make that happen within a family where kid has one problem or another and you're kind of counseling with them?
This works every time, by the way. We just forget the diagnoses for a minute. Now, whatever the problem is, trust me, whatever you think that your kid has done that's so heinous, I've seen worse. I've probably done worse. Forget it. Whatever the diagnosis is, let's just talk through this, and let's just assume that this is a person with something to gain in this world and your family, a relationship worth rekindling, and see where we can go. The sky's the limit.
I do this. You and I spend so much time. People are always throwing convention. That people are always saying to me, "Oh yeah, well you know this," and then they tell me what I know, and then they tell me something about recovery or sobriety.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And then it depends how irked I am. I'll say, please don't tell me what I know. If you want to know what I know, you could ask me a question. And by the way, you might try asking the child a question or the person we're talking about, the person of concern here. But I throw out, you and I limited our careers. I mean, I was a licensed psychologist. I had to write down diagnoses. I was an advisor. I was in the advisory group for substance use disorders in DSM-4. So I have some concept of what those numbers are about. I've been through them.
Yeah.
But in actual conversations, I never use any diagnosis. I never talk about OCD. I never volunteer terms like bipolar. I never even say depressed. I'm the most some people say, well, I'm against labels. I can't even wrap my lips around them to utter them for the same reason that you described.
Mm-hmm.
So I do exactly what you do. I say, well, tell me what the problem is. What are you worried about exactly? Let's just break it down into what's happening. By the way, let me jump back to the Life Process Program. That's what we do with the Life Process. The same people who were interviewing me from this rehab, I say, well, we don't actually do diagnostics. And then they say, well, when do you decide a person's had a problem? And I say, well, first of all, people don't get sent to us, we're online. So they have to come to us because they have a problem. That's just the way it works. And then we begin by saying, well, what's your problem? What are you worried about? And then, we work our way around to where does that fit into, drugs or alcohol or whatever, some addictive thing. And one of the things that we also do, that we also recognize, is that they're using the drugs or alcohol for something, or sex or food, it's fulfilling some kind of function. So we're not, to say you're against drugs or alcohol or food or sex, well, who's against sex exactly, or who's against love? I mean, or who's against food? I mean, those are expanding the notion of addiction makes it clear that you can't be against something. So that's another whole area that you and I aren't coping well in the modern universe, because people are against drugs and there's a big anti-alcohol movement now. And I say, well, I'm not, and obviously Carl Hart's talking about, well, who's against drugs? People take drugs. I take drugs. So I'm not against any of those things. And if we're about anything, we're about embracing life. We just published a letter online on the Life Process Program where a guy wrote in, he said something like, well, I was in 12-step programs. It just never worked for me. However, I'm only hanging on. The only reason I don't, take that drugs destructively is out of concern for my family. And I wrote back, well, that's a good start.
Mm-hmm.
Works for me, you know what I mean? You have a family, that's a good start. You care about them, that's good. We want to expand that realm of care things that you like about the universe and about yourself. That's what we're about. That the life process program is getting engaged in the life processes of people. We don't focus on the drugs. I always make the joke. It's not a joke. Addie Jaffe said, "Oh, Stanton, Peele, Bruce Alexander, and Carl Hart are all radical environmentalists." And then I make the joke, well, none of us blows up power
Yeah,
plants.
yeah. You did know the guy who became head of Greenpeace, but that's not what Audi
Right.
means about you.
That's the thing. He didn't blow anything up. And then we're about how people deal with their lives and the worlds around them, and and what that they're I'd say both Carl and Bruce maybe focus more on, but Bruce is kind of a socialist, like what those systems are like, and those are important things. But neither of them is like a therapist or a coach. We're trying to get people to expand how it is they hook into the world.
So in a way, we're encouraging people to identify values and expand their values. And I think a lot of people, especially my age, maybe I think Adi's probably a little older than me, but for some reason there's such a hesitancy to say the word values. Like it's like you're a finger wagger or something like that. You can't be compatible if you talk about values and expanding them. For some reason, you can't be compatible. And I think that's maybe where Sheff is coming from too. You can't be compatible with like the compassionate, let's not blame people kind of a thing.
I mean, I tune into people out of their capacity for joy, out of their competence, and out of their values. What do they think? Those are the things I'm tuned into. And I had a medical procedure, and there was a guy who was an immigrant doctor who was in charge of anesthesiology, and there was a young guy in his 20s, maybe. Who knows what all those people's jobs are? And I saw that he was overlooking the anesthesiologist, and he was worried. I could see that. And he sort of made some adjustments in whatever was happening. And when you're in that situation, you're not going to jump up and say, "Hey, I don't like the job the anesthesiologist is doing. I'm leaving."
Yeah.
So afterwards, I was in the recovery room, and that young man walked by, and I said, "Hey, could I talk to you for a second?" And he said, "Sure." And I said, "I happened to notice, before I went out, the lights went out, that you were kind of really tuned in to making sure, the dials were right, or whatever the hell you were doing. And, I really appreciate that." And I say, "Obviously you're a concerned human being. That's why you have this job. And you don't know me at all. So I'm assuming you try and make sure everybody who comes in that room doesn't die, or whatever bad can happen to you. Sometimes, some famous people have died in that regard." And then I said to him, "Could you do me a favor? Could you tell your parents something on my behalf? Could you tell your parents that I said that they brought you up right?" Because, he's a concerned, professional, competent, caring human being. Not bad. It's a good start, and I am, and that's something that parents give to their children. They taught them not to be a bully at school, and if people pick on somebody, I'm making this all up. I have no idea. To side with the underdog and to help them out. To try and be kind to people. To try, if you have a job and people pay you money to do the job right. He seemed to be expressing a number of values, and those are values I'm pretty confident that he learned at home. So what's our answer in short? So parents, they don't want their kids to become addicted or have drug or other compulsive or negative behaviors. And then sometimes they get enmeshed in them. These are three cases, or four we're talking about: William Cope Moyers and Hunter Biden and Harry Cunnane and Nic Sheff. How do you minimize or reduce that downtime and create a pathway into a better place for them?
help those people, encourage those people to become engaged with life, and not just engaged with life for the sake of doing it. I mean, it's got to be something meaningful. Like we had talked in our book about Angela Duckworth's grit, and she was talking about having, perseverance and zeal about and grit about a subject, but you can't really tell people will just be gritty. They have to have some sort of skill and latch on to something that interests them so much that it's worth falling down and picking yourself back up to continue to pursue. So that's one thing. Helping people realize that they're worth taking care of. That's another. And, you could do that in a variety of ways. One way is simply listening to people. And I don't mean like listen, but on your terms. I mean, really listen to what's going on. And people always talk about this non-judgmental philosophy. And all those philosophies are always so judgmental. No one's asked. I ask pretty simple questions with kids I work with. I even will say, I'll bring up whatever the team says. Hey, it sounds like you're having a tough time, A, B, and C. What's going on? And the what's going on sometimes elicits an answer. And when that answer happens, I'll reflect it back. And then we'll problem solve from there. Or sometimes there's no answer. And I can even say, either something's going on, you don't want to talk about it. Maybe I'm not even the right guy. Or maybe you haven't figured out what's going on yet. And that's a space to explore. And so you can sort of take from that and build upon it, however big or whatever scale you want. That's the most common sense answer I can give for a parent or for a professional working with another human being, a kid or anybody, to be able to have that kind of a conversation and be open and caring enough to do it.
I was once teaching a clinical course at an unnamed university, and I had a co-teaching partner, and she showed a video of a guy supposedly doing motivational interviewing, and he wasn't. He was pushing a set of values. And the joke I always use, I must have used it before, when my Uncle Ozzie quit smoking because he didn't want to be held captive by the tobacco industry. Well, and he was a way left-wing union guy. I say, well, obviously the cure to addiction is communism. That's a joke because you're just going to have to go in and ferret out what that person thinks about.
Right. Yeah.
When you're talking about getting attached to life, the advantage that Jamie Lee Curtis, William Cope Moyers, Nic Sheff, Harry Cunnane have, they are coming from a family with skills and background. I mean, they're coming from an elite group of people. And, the joke, I already made it once. Why don't you just write a bestseller? And Nic Sheff's like, whatever, in his late 20s. You have to know how to write to do that. So he may have been taking a lot of drugs. He wasn't, he had, I believe, younger siblings. His father had a second wife, which, that's not, I'm not going to put that down. That just happens.
Right.
But he was raised in an educated environment. He had good word skills, so that, an obvious transition you would look to, or the one that he actually made, is, going into the written and spoken word. He knows how to communicate. His father's before all this happened, he was a big successful professional writer. He gave the last interview to John and Yoko Ono. That was a famous thing he wrote. He knows how to engage with and write and to communicate with people. I guess if I would be, David Sheff wanted to make contact with me, and that didn't work, if I would have worked with somebody like him, and this is totally out of the air, I would say, well, you communicate when you interview with people. You didn't tell Yoko Ono and John Lennon what they believed in. Who would do that? I mean, he's a Beatle, for God's sake. That respect where you're trying to elicit what they know and think and how they look at the world, that's a clinical skill in itself. Interviewers know how to do.
In Beautiful Boy, I read it and I had reactions to it. In Beautiful Boy. My reactions to it were that he kept talking about what a golden child he had with no problems. He did well at school. He loved surfing. He loved doing stuff. And he really does And the thing is, like, I feel bad talking about it. Like you said, we don't know him. We don't know for sure what was going on there and the difficulties. And you don't know until you're in a situation what you would or wouldn't do. But he's putting himself out there and being vulnerable. It's almost like the essence of the book is, look how vulnerable I'm being talking about this experience. And then it all hinges on the drug changing his brain chemistry. Like, or how else would a well put together kid who's doing really great and we have a good relationship, how else would it all happen except for that? And
Well,
so
how can you explain it? Yeah.
you're talking about, there's two things we could talk about. One, how do you avoid getting in that situation or getting in such a tricky situation? And one of the things is maybe, don't assume that whatever your own values are the same thing that kid values. You can help instill values, but the things that motivate you or that you think should motivate your kid aren't necessarily the things that motivate them. So your ideas of their successes may not feel like that to them. And so you can talk about those things. And then there's the other end of it. When someone is encountering problems, you want to be able to do the same thing, except now you have, of course, the added burden of a new problem that's arising. So you have to work backwards a little bit, but the principles all stay the same. You just want to know what's going on in life, what people feel like.
Same problem solving. I mean, he's
right.
His Wikipedia entry says he's into training people in skills. He's got skills.
Mm-hmm.
And his son's got skills. Our life process program identifies skills that people have. And I know you do that with children. They come in and their skills are maybe not a good match for the classroom setting they're in, but that doesn't mean they don't have any skills, A. And B, it doesn't mean that those skills can't be harnessed or utilized in the classroom settings.
They're labeled in that case as having a deficit in something always. That's the label. And people don't read between the lines. It means there's something that they're not applying themselves in a way that makes them successful in that environment. But that doesn't mean they have a deficit in a way that they can't live a fulfilling life. And people just never make that connection.
And you and I have had varieties of that experience. Your skill set wasn't always labeled as a skill set, but you had a skill set. I mean, you weren't a destructive person, but you weren't kind of latching on to mainstream success there. But it wasn't because you didn't have a set of skills. And it turned out somehow, and when I interviewed you, we got into that, they discovered the skills that you're describing here you had, and you can manifest them. I had this strange situation that my mother was very tuned into my skill set, and she wasn't concerned about how that matched with the school skill set. That can go different ways. I could have become a master criminal. But instead, I just developed my own kind of mindset, my own way of doing things, which worked well enough. I mean, I have a PhD and a law degree, but, I never thought to myself, well, this is how they do it, ABC, that's how I'm going to do it. So being a little off center in your skill sets and even having some down periods and some decline and some negative experiences, we don't see that as being the end of the world. We see that as often, in a way, expressing something important. At the same time that we don't want people to be over involved with drugs. That's our line of work.
I visualize what you're talking about when I work with students or our clients as it's like I'm showing them that they can skip the line if they want to. Like, I know that you're being held up right here and you're in traffic or whatever, but there is this avenue.
You don't have to do it ABC is how I put up. We don't want you breaking any, we don't want you driving on the sidewalk. I hate those ads where people veer off the main path and run through the woods with their giant SUVs. So we don't encourage antisocial.
No, but there's always a diamond lane or whatever.
Right. But you have to have 3 people to get it.
Right. You do it the right way, but yeah.
You don't want people like putting like they did in New Jersey, a coat on the
right. Well, you make a good point. No one's teaching anyone to be.
I got a story about you, Zach.
Okay.
We went and we parked in a parking lot. Who knows what the municipalities in Burlington are?
I can't believe you remember this.
The parking lot in Burlington, and if you go, it's 25 cents an hour if you're from Burlington. And how the hell are they going to know? Because, you know, your driver's license they're not going to look. So you confess that you were actually from South Burlington. So you had to pay whatever, 75 cents an hour. So, you know, I thought that maybe was an extra step that maybe I wouldn't have bought. It took effort to do that. You had to explain to the lady, oh, I'm from South Burlington.
Yeah.
So I can't do the Burlington parking fee. Okay, you know, I'm not going to criticize that, but you and I we don't disrupt the social order. We, you know, we work within it at the same time that we don't feel that we have to do things the way that they lay them out in the guidebooks.
Right.
So, okay, I hope we didn't claim that we were going to, or those people have all that we've mentioned have all grown up and they're fine now. Good enough.
Oh, by the way, it certainly if social order is imposing itself unnecessarily onto a person, I think that's just to make clear that's what we're talking about. Then you can kind of say maybe everyone in a person's life will say, well, you can't do it this way, and you can give a person enough motivation and confidence and recognizing skills and resources to say, well, yeah, I can, let me show you, and they can still fit in. Right. It's just you don't have to accept an undue label.
You're with kids who are sometimes you don't want them to be destructive,
right?
Certainly to themselves or their families or to the classroom. That's not our game, but you don't want them to be suppressed just because they may have a unique way of expressing things, as long as it's makes a positive, you know, impact on the environment.
People become way more pro-social when they are confident in themselves and they're doing something worthwhile. It never goes the other way. So.
And you know, I know you've gotten kids to communicate through their visual skills or through their technical skills. That they have a skill set, and you want them to see themselves as that's your goal. You work in a school system. You want people to graduate and be able to support themselves and be a positive member of society. We're not, you know, crazy radicals. Well, okay, we've done as much as we can, perhaps, you know, laying out the values. So, you know, we're trying to draw together. You can't read those three. You're not going to read those three books and say, I know what the right answer is.
Right.
And we're trying to come up with some underlying theme, tools, techniques for parents and educators. We're swimming upstream for the reasons you described when you're sitting in those rooms and people say, let's ask Zach for some of his crazy ideas. They work, but let's not go overboard and sort of make them school policy, you know?
So you laid out sort of some people who you'll catch in the news and, you know, their lives, for whatever destruction they may have done to them, their lives are, there's enough to pluck there to build a successful life. And that's not exactly what they're saying in their memoirs or stories about how they overcame things. They're saying, you know, I surrendered myself to whatever rehab or all this stuff. And you're just saying, okay, who's calling you a liar? The thing is, everyone reading your story does know these other things about you and kind of seems to map onto everything that you might do to work with a person who doesn't have all those things.
Now we're always apparent in you. Who knows why they weren't recognized, maybe by you yourself, and you get satisfaction from them now. And you know, in the case of Nic Sheff, he got satisfaction from them when he was a kid, and he sort of circled back into them. And you know, why did he get off them? We don't know exactly. We can't say. And we know, you and I know people who don't circle back into them. Talented kids who, you know, the person I'm describing who ended up dead before that child was 30 had been a really talented a child. And you know, it's our you know, it's the greatest tragedy is somebody with great skills, to me, like Amy Winehouse, among others, can't get on track. You know, I don't know Amy Winehouse, but we imagine, we like to think as helpers that those are the kinds of people in particular that we'd be able to help. People with gifts and a skill set and a success record. That's one thing we always, when we very much in life process, it's called strength-based. We refocus people on their successes, on the skills they have. We ask them in their narrative, well, why don't you describe, I know you've had some ups and downs in your life story. Why don't you write the life story that, like if you were going to write a resume and you were going to claim, I'm God's gift to humanity, you shade things and you emphasize the positive. Why don't you just do that? Just talk about your successes just for this little exercise. And that's one view of them. And we want them to fit into that mold of themselves.
I have an exercise that I do with parents that I actually took from a woman named Janine Fitzgerald, who I work with. I've talked about her before. She has people in a training, and this is what I do now for a parent about their kids, write 2 different lists. They call it the bug and brag list. This is sort of like a CBT exercise. And so bug, all the things that piss you off about your kid, that you're really having a hard time with. Brag, if you had to talk, write your Christmas card to your family members or whatever it is, and all the amazing skills that they have, write it out and then fold it in half and just look at the skills, and remember it. It's,
well, you're doing our therapy practice, and what you're dealing with the kid is, don't forget that whole skill set and emphasize it. Move you and the child move on to that side of the list, because, they ended up in rehab or they ended up hiring you because of the problem list. We can't ignore it.
So I just wanted to circle around. I know you might want to tie everything together in a certain way. I wanted to circle back around because you talked about parents, the people we know whose children have died under the auspices of people who are supposed to be taking great care of their kids. And a common theme that I see running through there, something I think we're trying to address, is that there's always a specialist saying to that parent, we've got him from here, or we've got her from here. Just you chill out. You don't get it. We'll take care of it, fix the person and send them back. And then there's always a parent there that doesn't feel like they have the leverage to say, I think I know my kid, what do you know that I don't know about my kid, or something like that. And tragically, everyone I've spoken to from that organization and others who have lost a child and have been in that situation have always, they lost their kid, and then they are always thinking, I fucking knew it. I knew it. I knew that I knew my kid better. I knew it. Why didn't I? And so they're always,
they're sort of sitting there listening to that lecture about either their kid or about how great the program is, and they have these nagging doubts.
Right.
And they're sitting there thinking,
but who am I?
They're the experts.
Yeah.
I mean, for God's sake, this is a rehab. We're paying, $35,000. They've been doing this forever. You and I are both blessed and cursed. We don't think that way. We don't go into a room and they start lecturing us about how the right answer is. Our mind doesn't go to, well, I better memorize this list. You know what I mean? We're sitting there chewing it over, and saying, does this make sense? And more often than not, we're questioning what that is. And that's a really great point you made. Whenever these people tell me these stories, I feel the lingering sadness that they, and I have to fight myself for saying, you believe them? That's well, who knows? Your kid's in trouble and you're not that old yourself by then. Who knows what I used to believe? And you're buying that, and they're still regretting buying it. That's part of their regret network, right, along with whatever happened between them and the child. And David Sheff has that. Geez, I turned him over for these rehabs, and every one of the people we mentioned could have that kind of regret. Was that really the best thing? And people express that all the time.
You mentioned that we're blessed and cursed not to think that way, and my father brought this up to me the other day when I was really young. I was asked what I want to do when I grow up, and not knowing how to put the semantics together, I said, I want to grow up and I want to work a job where I work really hard, but I don't make a lot of money. I don't know why I was trying to be virtuous or something. I think I was 2 or something like that. And he said, "You got your wish." And I think about when people, I know that you've gotten these letters before or whatever, emails or people on social media saying, well, it must be nice for you. You're just sucking up all the money. And it's like, if you wanted to really do that, I could lead you down, the avenues you could go down to make all the money. You're not in it for the dough.
Well, I'm not, and I actually feel sorry for people who have so much money that they can just spend it doing anything. That's not how I think that's wasteful. I don't want to live that way. I like to live by my wits, and I like to feel I can always, at any moment, I just turned 75 last month. I still have a set of skills that I can't exactly go out in the street and sell, but somebody's going to call me up and they're going to want to employ me. And, I actually feel sorry for people who have a superabundance of money. I positively don't want to have all that money. I've never bought a lottery ticket in my life. I don't want to live.
Just one if you won. Yeah, right.
Well, all right. We've gone pretty far afield here, but
Yep.
what the hell? What else to do when it's snowing or something out here in Brooklyn? So we tried to make sense, try to encourage people to follow their own light beacons in light, to have more confidence in their own instincts with their child. We want to nurture them. At the same time, we want to augment. We have an exercise in the life process program where we teach people motivational interviewing. We teach people who are clients, how do you go about helping other people through asking questions? And the interaction involves talk to a person about the problems and never say a single thing about giving them advice, only ask further questions. So we try and teach them these techniques. And, parents need to be able to ask their kids questions, and they need to be able to ask critical questions when somebody's laying a chip on them about their expertise, their template for how their kid's going to get better.
Beautifully tied together. And so, Stanton, let's sign off now and say happy Sunday morning to everybody who's tuning in, and make sure to tune in later in the week for so that we can take your questions.
Au revoir.